Millfield, Ohio, 1965. The morning Elizabeth Campbell disappeared was unremarkable in every way. September 8th, the third day of a new school year, dawned clear and mild in the small manufacturing town of Millfield. Elizabeth, Lizzie to her family and friends, had eaten breakfast with her parents and younger brother as usual. Her mother, Margaret, packed her lunch while her father, Robert, read the morning newspaper, occasionally commenting on the escalating situation in Vietnam. "Do you think they'll draft Billy Harrington?" Lizzie asked, referring to their neighbor's son who had just turned 18. Robert Campbell lowered his paper, his expression grave. "I hope not, sweetheart, but it's hard to say." At 7:45 a.m., Lizzie kissed her mother goodbye, hoisted her book bag over her shoulder, and stepped out into the golden September morning. She was 12 years old, entering 7th grade, with auburn hair pulled back in a neat ponytail and a sprinkling of freckles across her nose. She wore a blue plaid dress her mother had sewn for the new school year, white ankle socks, and saddle shoes recently polished for the occasion. The walk to Millfield Junior High took exactly 17 minutes at Lizzie's usual pace. Her route never varied. Down Maple Street where Campbells lived, left on Elm, right on Jefferson past the town library, then straight to the school. It was a safe, familiar route through a town where most people knew each other by name. At 8:25 a.m., Mrs. Helen Driscoll took attendance in homeroom 7B. When she called Elizabeth Campbell and received no answer, she marked her absent without much thought. Children got sick, especially in the early weeks of school, when new germs circulated. At 3:30 p.m., Margaret Campbell called the school when Lizzie hadn't returned home. She was informed that her daughter had been absent all day. If this mystery has you leaning closer to the screen, now's the perfect time to hit that like button. It helps us bring you more cases just like this. And while you're here, subscribe to Gone Cold and turn on notifications so you're the first to uncover the truth with us every week. By 4 p.m., Robert Campbell had called the police. By nightfall, most of Millfield was searching for a girl who had vanished somewhere along the 17-minute walk to school. The days that followed were a blur of police interviews, search parties, and mounting dread. Lizzie's photo, her school portrait from 6th grade showing a serious-faced girl with intelligent eyes, appeared in newspapers across Ohio. Her parents made tearful television appeals. Her classmates were questioned repeatedly about any unusual people or vehicles they might have seen that morning. No one had seen anything out of the ordinary. No one had noticed Lizzie Campbell on her walk to school. No witnesses came forward with useful information. It was as if she had simply stepped out of existence somewhere between Maple Street and Millfield Junior High. As weeks stretched into months, the active investigation gradually waned. The Campbells refused to give up hope, establishing a small foundation in their daughter's name and ensuring her case remained open. But eventually, life in Millfield returned to its rhythms, the town carrying the weight of an unanswered question that grew heavier with each passing year. What happened to Elizabeth Campbell on that ordinary September morning became Millfield's defining mystery, a story told to children as both warning and ghost story, a tragedy that marked the end of an era when parents felt safe letting their children walk to school alone. And somewhere in Millfield, the truth remained hidden, waiting to be discovered. Millfield, Ohio, 2023. "I still think we should have bought that place in Columbus," grumbled Michael Chin as he pried away another section of damaged drywall in what would eventually be their renovated kitchen. Dust filled the air, adding another layer to the fine powder already coating every surface of the 1940s craftsman home he and his wife had purchased 3 months earlier. "And pay twice as much for half the house," replied his wife, Emma, who was carefully scraping layers of old wallpaper from the adjacent dining room. "Besides, you were the one who fell in love with the built-ins and the original hardwood floors." Michael grunted in acknowledgement, unable to deny that the house's character had indeed won him over despite his initial reservations about moving to a small town. As an architect who worked primarily remotely, he could appreciate the solid construction and thoughtful design of these older homes, even when they required significant updating. "I just hope we finish before the baby arrives," he said, glancing at Emma's growing belly, now in its 6th month. "At this rate, our daughter's first bedroom might be a construction zone." The wall Michael was removing separated the original galley kitchen from a small breakfast nook, an unnecessary division of space by modern standards. As he pulled away a particularly stubborn piece of drywall, something fluttered to the ground amid the dust and debris. "What's that?" Emma asked, noticing him bending to retrieve something. Michael brushed dust from what appeared to be an envelope, yellowed with age. "Looks like an old letter," he said, turning it over in his hands. The front bore a single word in faded blue ink. "Mom." "Probably just a note from the previous owners," Emma suggested, setting down her scraper and coming closer to inspect the find. "The Williamsons only owned the house for 5 years," Michael reminded her, "and this looks much older than that." He carefully opened the envelope, which wasn't sealed, and removed a single sheet of lined paper, folded in thirds. The handwriting was neat, but clearly that of a young person, rounded letters formed with careful precision. As Michael unfolded the letter and began to read, his expression changed from curiosity to shock. "Emma," he said, his voice suddenly tense, "look at this." The letter read, "Dear Mom, if you find this, I'm in the basement of the yellow house on Jefferson Street, the one with the broken fence. Mr. Doyle took me there. He says he's keeping me until the police stop looking. He has a gun. Please help me. I'm scared. Love, Lizzie Campbell." September 8th, 1965 . Emma's hand went to her mouth. Lizzie Campbell? Why does that name sound familiar? Michael was already reaching for his phone. "I think we need to call the police." The officer who responded to their call, Sergeant Gloria Washington, recognized the name immediately. She was a Millfield native, though she had been born years after the disappearance. "Elizabeth Campbell is probably the most famous missing person case in town history," she explained, carefully placing the letter in an evidence bag. "I grew up hearing about her. Every kid in Millfield did. She vanished walking to school, and they never found her or figured out what happened. And this letter was just hidden inside our wall." Emma asked, still trying to process the implications. "For almost 60 years? Sergeant Washington nodded grimly. "The previous owners bought the house from the estate of Harold Johnson, who lived here from 1953 until his death in 2018. Before we jump to conclusions, we need to verify if this letter is authentic and investigate this yellow house on Jefferson." "Does Jefferson Street even have a yellow house?" Michael asked. "It did," the officer replied. "It was torn down in the 1980s to build a new library, but in the 60s it belonged to a man named Edward Doyle." The news spread through Millfield like wildfire. A letter apparently written by Lizzie Campbell on the day she disappeared had been discovered behind a wall. The local police department, ill-equipped to handle such a complex cold case, quickly involved the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation. Within days, forensic experts, detectives specialized in historical cases, and even an FBI consultant had descended on the small town. The letter itself was determined to be authentic. The paper, ink, and handwriting all consistent with the time period. Handwriting analysis, comparing the letter with samples of Lizzie's schoolwork preserved by her parents, indicated a strong likelihood that Lizzie had indeed written it. How it came to be hidden in the wall of a house on Maple Street, several blocks from Jefferson, remained a mystery. Michael and Emma Chin found themselves at the center of unexpected attention. Local news vans parked on their street, and reporters approached them for comments about their discovery. They declined all interviews, uncomfortable with the media's tendency to sensationalize what was, at its core, a tragic story about a child in danger. More significant to the investigation was the name mentioned in Lizzie's letter, Edward Doyle. Records confirmed that Doyle had indeed owned the yellow house on Jefferson Street in 1965. He had been a maintenance worker at Millfield Manufacturing, the factory where Lizzie's father worked as a foreman. Doyle had been questioned during the original investigation as part of the routine canvass of the community, but had provided an alibi. He was supposedly at work when Lizzie disappeared. Now, investigators discovered that Doyle had called in sick on September 8th, 1965, information that somehow hadn't been connected to the case at the time. This crucial detail transformed him from peripheral figure to primary suspect. But Edward Doyle, like the yellow house, was long gone. He had moved away from Millfield in 1966, less than a year after Lizzie's disappearance, and died in Florida in 1997. Whatever secrets he held had died with him. Margaret Campbell, now 85 and living in a nursing home in Cincinnati, was informed of the discovery by a detective who drove 3 hours to deliver the news in person. Robert had passed away in 2010, never knowing what happened to his daughter. Their son, James, now a man in his 60s, stood at his mother's side as she read the last words her daughter had written. "I always knew she didn't run away," Margaret said, her hands trembling as she held a photocopy of the letter. The original remained in evidence. "My Lizzie was trying to come home to us." With the yellow house long demolished, investigators focused on ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs at the library site. The basement of the former house would have been filled in during construction, but evidence might still remain beneath the modern foundation. After 2 days of careful scanning and excavation of targeted areas, investigators made a grim discovery. Human remains buried several feet below the library storage room. Preliminary examination suggested they belonged to a young person, quite possibly a girl around 12 years old. DNA testing would be needed to confirm the identity, but the location matched Lizzie's letter exactly. As the remains were carefully exhumed and transported for forensic analysis, the town of Millfield confronted a haunting reality. The answer to their oldest mystery had been literally beneath their feet for decades. Children had checked out books and attended story time just feet above where Lizzie Campbell had been hidden away. For Michael and Emma Chun, the discovery brought mixed emotions. Their renovation had inadvertently solved a 58-year-old cold case, potentially bringing closure to a family that had lived with uncertainty for decades. But it also meant their new home was now linked to a tragic story, a connection that would likely follow the property for years to come. "Do you regret buying this place now?" Emma asked Michael as they lay in bed that night, listening to the autumn wind rustling the maple trees outside their window. Michael was quiet for a long moment. "No," he finally said. "I keep thinking about Margaret Campbell, living all these years without knowing. If tearing down our kitchen wall helped bring her some peace, how could I regret that?" What remained unexplained was how Lizzie's letter had ended up in their wall on Maple Street, so far from where she had apparently been held captive. And why? If she had managed to write and hide a letter, had she been unable to escape? As investigators continued piecing together events from nearly 6 decades earlier, one thing became increasingly clear. The story of Elizabeth Campbell's disappearance was far more complex than anyone had imagined, and the letter behind the wall was just the beginning of the truth finally emerging into the light. 2 weeks after the discovery of human remains beneath the Millfield Public Library, DNA testing confirmed what everyone had suspected. The bones belonged to Elizabeth Campbell. The forensic examination revealed blunt force trauma to the skull, suggesting she had died from a violent blow to the head. With this confirmation, investigators intensified their efforts to understand how Lizzie's letter had traveled from Jefferson Street to the wall of the house on Maple Street. The answer emerged from property records and interviews with elderly residents who remembered the 1960s. Harold Johnson, the longtime owner of the Chen's house, had been more than just a resident of Maple Street. He had worked as a handyman and general contractor in Millfield for over 40 years. Among his clients in the 1960s, Edward Doyle. Harold did some renovation work on the Yellow House in late '65, explained 87-year-old Walter Simmons, a retired plumber who had occasionally worked with Johnson. Eddie hired him to fix some water damage in the basement, said a pipe had burst. This revelation provided the missing link. Investigators theorized that Lizzie had managed to write her desperate note while captive, perhaps hiding it among her belongings. When Harold Johnson came to work on the basement, possibly the very room where she was being held, she had somehow slipped the letter to him or hidden it where she hoped he would find it. But Johnson, for reasons that might never be known, hadn't taken the letter to the police. Instead, he had hidden it in his own house, sealing it within a wall during a renovation of his kitchen in early 1966. People often ask why he didn't come forward. Detective Alicia Martinez told reporters at a press conference, "We can only speculate. Maybe he was afraid of Doyle. Maybe he discovered the letter after Lizzie was already dead and felt guilty for not finding it sooner. Or maybe he tried to report it anonymously and wasn't taken seriously. What seemed increasingly clear was that Harold Johnson had carried the secret with him for over 50 years, until his death in 2018. Whether out of fear, guilt, or some misguided attempt at protection, he had hidden evidence that might have solved the case decades earlier and brought Doyle to justice while he was still alive. For Margaret Campbell, these revelations brought a complicated mixture of closure and renewed grief. "I've lived most of my life wondering," she told her son James as they prepared for Lizzie's long-delayed funeral. "Now I know, but it doesn't bring her back. And it doesn't answer why. Why Lizzie? Why did this man take my little girl?" The why that haunted Margaret Campbell became the focus of the investigation's next phase. With both Doyle and Johnson deceased, detectives turned to historical records, interviews with those who had known both men, and a careful examination of the original case files from 1965. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Doyle's ex-wife, Caroline, now living in a retirement community in Arizona. When contacted by investigators, she provided insight into the man who had become Millfield's most notorious criminal. Eddie had a temper, especially when he drank, she explained during a video interview. But what really ate at him was resentment. He couldn't stand feeling disrespected or overlooked. This resentment, it turned out, had extended to Robert Campbell, Lizzie's father. As foreman at Millfield Manufacturing, Robert had written up Doyle multiple times for safety violations and had been instrumental in Doyle being passed over for promotion. "He talked about Campbell sometimes," Caroline recalled. "Said the man thought he was better than everyone else." I remember Eddie coming home furious after Campbell reported him for drinking on the job in August of '65. He kept saying he'd make Campbell sorry. The picture that emerged was tragically simple. Lizzie Campbell had been a victim of revenge, targeted not for anything she had done, but as a way to hurt her father. Edward Doyle, nursing his grievances and likely fueled by alcohol, had seen her walking alone that September morning and acted on his darkest impulses. Harold Johnson's role remained more ambiguous. Former colleagues described him as a quiet, conflict-averse man who minded his own business. This temperament might explain his reluctance to come forward if he discovered evidence of Doyle's crime. Johnson probably found himself in an impossible situation, Detective Martinez theorized. He suspected or knew what Doyle had done, but was afraid of implicating himself for not reporting it immediately. So he preserved the evidence but hid it away, maybe thinking someone would find it eventually. For the Chens, this new information brought some relief. Their home hadn't been directly connected to Lizzie's abduction or death, merely to the complicated moral failing of a man who had hidden evidence rather than confronting a terrible truth. As the investigation wound down, the town of Millfield began processing decades of unresolved trauma. The library temporarily closed for a memorial service, and discussions began about creating a permanent remembrance for Lizzie on the grounds. For the first time since 1965, Elizabeth Campbell's school portrait was removed from the missing section of the Ohio Bureau of Investigation's website. Her case was officially closed. On a crisp October day, almost exactly 58 years after she disappeared, Elizabeth Campbell was laid to rest in Millfield Cemetery. The funeral procession stretched for nearly a mile, including not only family and old friends, but hundreds of community members born long after Lizzie had vanished. Her story had become part of the town's identity, and her homecoming, even under such tragic circumstances, felt like a communal catharsis. Margaret Campbell, wheelchair-bound but clear-eyed and composed, received condolences beside the small casket that contained her daughter's remains. Among those who came to pay respects were Michael and Emma Chun, who had hesitated about attending but ultimately felt connected to Lizzie's story through their inadvertent role in resolving it. "Thank you," Margaret said simply when Emma introduced herself. "You brought my daughter home." In the months that followed, Millfield underwent subtle but significant changes. The library reopened with a reading garden dedicated to Lizzie's memory, featuring a bronze statue of a girl with a book. The local school district implemented new educational programs about child safety, using age-appropriate materials to teach children about potential dangers without instilling fear. The Chens decided to stay in Millfield, completing their home renovation and welcoming their daughter, whom they named Elizabeth, Ellie for short, in tribute to the girl whose story had become intertwined with their own. They accepted that their home would always carry a certain history, but they chose to view it not as a burden, but as a responsibility to remember. As for Harold Johnson's moral failing, the town's judgment softened somewhat when his personal journals were discovered among his possessions. Entries from late 1965 revealed a man tormented by fear and indecision. Found something at Dee's house today. Read one cryptic note. Don't know what to do. If I'm right, it's terrible. If I'm wrong, I destroy a man's life with suspicion. Need to think. Later entries suggested he had anonymously called the police with his concerns, but had not been taken seriously without tangible evidence. By the time he considered coming forward directly, Doyle had already left town, and Johnson convinced himself it was too late to make a difference. Sometimes people make the wrong choice for what they think are the right reasons, Detective Martinez reflected in her final case report. Johnson's silence was a moral failure that let a killer escape justice, but his preservation of the letter eventually brought truth to light, even if decades too late. 1 year after the Chens discovered the letter, a small gathering took place at Millfield Cemetery. Margaret Campbell, who had moved back to her hometown in her final months, had passed away peacefully, outliving her husband by 13 years, but finally joining him and their long-lost daughter. Her son James stood with his own grown children and grandchildren. Family members Lizzie had never had the chance to meet. Michael and Emma brought their baby daughter, now crawling and curious about the world. As they stood before the family plot, where 3 generations of Campbells now rested, Emma felt a sense of completion. "It's strange," she said quietly to Michael as they walked back to their car. "So many lives connected by a single hidden letter. Makes you wonder what other secrets are waiting to be found, what other stories need to be told." In their home on Maple Street, now warm with new life and fresh beginnings, they had left one small reminder of the past. In the renovated kitchen, behind a framed photograph of their family, was a tiny inscription carved into new wall. For Lizzie, remembered. Some stories never truly end. They simply wait for someone to uncover them, to bring light to long-shadowed corners, to give voice to those who were silenced too soon. In Millfield, a town that had lived for decades with an unanswered question, the discovery of a letter behind a wall had finally written the ending to a story that had shaped generations. Elizabeth Campbell had found her way home at last. If this letter had been hiding in your home for decades, what would you have done? Like this video. Subscribe to Gone Cold for more real-life mysteries. And share your theory in the comments. Was Lizzie Campbell's fate finally revealed, or is there still a darker secret buried in Millfield's past? I'll be reading every single comment.